Welcome back, everyone, to this very last panel on the future of the Eastern Partnership framework. And I dare to say the very question whether there is, in fact, a future for this very framework. I know this is a bit audacious, a bit provocative, but as you can see, some people in the panel are already raising their eyebrows, so it seems as if I'm touching a nerve already. Good news and bad news, as always. The bad news is we are literally 1 hour and 10 minutes away from what I think has been a very rich and interesting and thought-provoking conference. The good news is we are still exposed or await a real cracker, if I may say, as I have the privilege to chair and moderate this panel of very distinguished speakers and experts when it comes to this very theme that we have been discussing throughout the day. And thirdly, I should actually add that even though, of course, I am in the midst of very distinguished speakers here, I feel as if I'm how should I say, in a relatively informal setting somewhat, as this feels a bit like family. And let me just briefly explain why. The reason simply is that all of these panelists here do have quite a link, a connection with the College of Europe. Ambassador Thomas Mayr-Harting here to my right is an alumnus of the College of Europe. Jan Hofmokl at the far right is an alumnus of the College of Europe. Professor Elena Korosteleva used to be or is a visiting professor at the College of Europe. Danu Radu to my left is currently a student here at the College of Europe. And last but not least, Ambassador Świtalski on my right here. What's his link? Exactly. Is currently, as you all know, serving as the EU's head of delegation to Armenia, and in that capacity, on a regular basis, receiving students of the College of Europe during our study trip. During our April, I remember 12th of April. Yes. You see, during our annual study trips to the South Caucasus. Before introducing very briefly our panelists, literally with a one-word sentence, I would now like to give the floor just for a minute or two to Yael Oliva, who is a student here at the College of Europe and the chairwoman of our Natolin European Neighbourhood Policy Society, which, as you know, has been organizing yesterday's New Generation Eastern Partnership Summit. And as far as we understand, you guys, the participants of this particular summit, have eventually come up with a declaration that you would like to very briefly explain and announce.
Distinguished Mr. Mayr-Harting, Honorable Mr. Hofmokl, Honorable Ambassador Świtalski, dear Mrs. Korosteleva, dear friend and colleague Radu Danu, dear guests, dear audience, dear participants, as the chairwoman of the ENP Society here at the College of Europe, allow me to thank you for your presence today and for your willingness to contribute to the 10th anniversary of the Eastern Partnership. I am pleased to announce that the very first Eastern Partnership New Generation Summit took place yesterday on our beautiful historical campus. It was so successful that we went to bed very late yesterday. But this time, it was not because we were partying in the bar downstairs, but because we were working very hard on this very youth declaration that I'm presenting to you today. As already mentioned this morning by the Vice Rector, the New Generation Summit brought together 39 young experts, practitioners, and students from various EU countries and from the 6 Eastern Partner countries to share our generation's perspective on the Eastern Partnership and its future. The participants of the summit were selected among over 100 applicants who responded to a call to participation by the ENP Students' Society. Such interest and enthusiasm generated by our calls our call demonstrates how much the Eastern Partnership is alive for a generation throughout and beyond the EU. Allow me now to say a few words about the summit in itself. The Eastern Partnership New Generation Summit consisted of several plenary sessions and of 4 working groups which revolved around the key platforms of the EAP. Each working group was chaired by 2 members of the ENP Student Society who channeled the discussions in order to generate clear-cut policy recommendations. We included these recommendations in a declaration on the future of the Eastern Partnership that we drafted yesterday night at the college. I stand here in front of you and on behalf of the ENP Student Society and all participants of the New Generation Summit, I am pleased to say that our summit was a success. It brought together critical minds of the new generation from within EU member states and EAP partner countries to take stock of 10 years of the Eastern Partnership and develop straightforward policy recommendations that we hope you will consider. I was personally very impressed by the quality of the discussions yesterday and by the stimulating inputs that each participant brought with them. So thank you. We truly hope that you will find the time to consider the entire declaration, as it represents the intense work of the 39 participants in their respective working groups. Last but not least, I want to warmly thank the college for their support in making this summit possible. We hope that the next generation, and by generation I mean next promotion of students here at Natolin, will continue this tradition and launch a 2nd edition of the EAP New Generation Summit. And that young, bright minds will, once again, gather here at Natolin to discuss the future of the EAP. Dear all, we, the new generation, the young generation, wish you a happy 10th anniversary, because it seems like it's an anniversary. I was pointed out several times today, of the Eastern Partnership, and we truly hope that our voice will be heard. I will now hand over the declaration to you, Mr. Mayr-Harting. We truly hope that you can, in various EU institutions, convey the message that it contains. To you, Mr. Hofmokl, we hope that you can also share this to the other member states. Then to you, Honorable Ambassador Świtalski, we also hope that you can give this, share it with your partners, our partners. And to you, Mrs. Korosteleva, we hope that you can share it with the academic world. And Radu, I don't need to give this to you because
Thank you very much, Yael, and of course, once again, thank you to all participants of yesterday's New Generation EAP Summit for your very hard work and your commitment and engagement. It is truly appreciated. So, without any further ado, as I said, I'll introduce the speakers very briefly. Let's start to my very right. Mr. Jan Hofmokl is the director of the Eastern Department here at the Polish Ministry for Foreign Affairs and plenipotentiary of the Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Eastern Partnership. Then we have my friend and colleague, Ambassador Thomas Mayr-Harting, who is Managing Director for Europe and Central Asia in the European External Action Service. Then here to my immediate right, Ambassador Świtalski, who, as I said, is currently serving, or has been serving already for quite some time, as the EU's head of delegation to Armenia, and, if I may say, has been one of the staunchest advocates for an agreement, in fact, with Armenia. And to my very left, again, Professor Elena Korosteleva, who is a very well-known probably one of the most renowned professors, academics in Europe, working on the Eastern Partnership in particular. She's a professor of international politics at the University of Kent, and also a Jean Monnet Chair in European politics. And last but not least, to my very left, Mr. Danu, who, as I said already, is one of our students from Moldova and, in fact, is also a young European ambassador. 2019 is not only does not only mark the 10th anniversary of the Eastern Partnership. 2019 is also an important moment, in fact, for us to reflect on the very future of this framework. We do have the upcoming European Parliament elections. The European Commission, as we all know, the mandate is ending rather soon. And as you may remember, President Juncker, when he took up office in November 2014, declared that the European Neighbourhood policy and the revision thereof at the time was supposed to be one of the key priorities of this Commission. And last but not least, of course, as you all know, we are currently in the midst of the multi-annual financial framework negotiations. So all of this combined, I think, serves as a very important mix for us to reflect on what to do, in fact, with the beast. Is there a future for it? And as I announced to my panelists already before, I will give each of them 5 minutes to put forward their views and opinions, give an impulse, and then we would open immediately the debate as we are pressed for time. Jan, can I ask you first?
You start, the clock is ticking.
The clock is ticking.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for the declaration. I pledge in front of everyone I'm going to send it today to all of the member states, Eastern Partnership ambassadors. So thank you very much, and I am pleased that I'll be the one carrying over the good gospel of the youth and its willingness to participate in the discussion, because this is precisely what we need, all stakeholders being involved. For 5 minutes, I have 5 points I wanted to raise with you. The first one is why it is so problematic to talk about the Eastern Partnership today. This is because when we discuss EU's relations with the East and a policy, and I emphasize the word policy, not program, not project, it's not an instrument, it is a full-fledged policy endorsed by 28 member states and 6 partner countries. When we touch upon its future, we touch the future of the European Union and what we want the European Union to be. And because we can't answer the question about the future of the European Union, we start struggling to think what we want for and from our partners. And this is something worth reflecting on. We still need to answer ourselves deep in our hearts what we want from the EU and how we want the EU to evolve. And then the answer, what to do with any policy we have, will come up much more easily or straight away, whether this will be that path or another. But first, we need to clean our house. And we are in the process of, some are saying destroying it, some are saying trying to structure it better. Second element would be the EAP doesn't operate in a vacuum. The region is in crisis, the European Union is in crisis. Who wants to bet with me whether there will be a Brexit or no? Right? So then if we don't know what contractual relations the UK, a member state, will have, how can we answer what we want from Ukraine, Georgia, and what we can offer Moldova or Belarus? But there are good signs of it as well. There are many ways the EU can work together. Brexit might be the way we test future relations with very close partners, the way it will be organized. Second element, there are plenty of different policies which are not encompassing everyone. Let us take Schengen, where some member states are not there even if they wanted. Some are not there because they didn't want. I mean, namely UK among others. But let us take the Eurozone. Not everyone is part of the Eurozone. Some member states, including the one I'm representing here, willingly decided to slow down its accession process. Good, bad, but still, there are ways to organize the European Union in different groupings that is already working. Then let us take PESCO. So security. When we come back to the basics of what the Eastern Partnership was, and more broadly what the neighborhood policy was, it was about security, stability, and prosperity with a ring of friends. It was not supposed to be a very geostrategic project. It occurred to be a policy that has geopolitical implications. So now we have to face that and factor that in what we want to do. So what Poland would like to do with the European Union and what it would like to offer to the Eastern partners. And this will be the last 3 points I want to cover with you. One is legal approximation. Association agreements, DCFTAs, CEPAs, all of the contractual relations that the EU is signing with these countries who are willingly taking the decision to get closer. These are tools to take over 95% of the acquis communautaire. In that respect, who wants to tell that the EAP or the ENP is not about getting closer and is not a kindergarten to operate like an EU member state at the end? If you're taking up a huge chunk of the acquis communautaire and you're starting to operate with the same way the EU operates, at some point you're getting more ready to get closer. Second element is sectoral integration, where there are plenty of sectors, we have common interests, we want to work together, there's a plethora of agencies, of programs, of instruments which are already open to member states and to non-member states. And we have a common interest. And let's take the easiest example, which is on the first page of any newspaper since many days. Civil aviation agencies. Why not have everyone in a very strong regulator that will be able to face a very centralized market like planes, where the American civil aviation regulator failed to make the planes which are operating secure. We have an interest to have everyone on board. So you may imagine plenty of other instruments. And the last point is, and this is the elephant in the room, institutional integration and political messaging. This is where we are struggling. So what Poland wants to propose is very concrete measures which will allow these countries to feel responsible for their own policy. The EAP is a partnership, maybe of equals. So why not suggest a secretariat of the EAP that would run the show with platforms, panels, and everyone assisting the Commission or taking over from the Commission some of the decisions? Why not create a presidency for the Eastern Partnership? Well, these partners could team up with EU presidencies, with the EEAS, and with the Commission to decide on the political agenda of what they want to discuss. Why not open some of the councils which are already testing, for instance, the Trade Council with EFTA countries is testing possibilities to discuss common areas of interest in one format. We do it with the ECOFIN. I mean, Euro ministers are there before non-Euro member ministers. So let's test institutional integration, but first among the six, to see whether they are ready to team up. They claim they are ready, now it's up to them to demonstrate that. And with these words, legal approximation, sectoral cooperation, and institutional and political integration, I will leave you, and I'm ready for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, for being so concise and, in fact, for complying with our strict time regime. I take note of the fact that yet again you put forward the idea of establishing a secretariat and thus institutionalizing EAP, EU relations to a much larger extent than is already the case, as this in fact has been a long-standing objective of subsequent Polish governments. And I wonder, of course, and I'm sure we're going to debate this eventually, how this in fact goes together with the second and very valid point that you addressed, namely the very fact that the EU itself seems to be in crisis and in fact is fragmented and is to some extent suffering from disintegration. So in that sense, there might not necessarily be an appetite for such initiatives. But I'm sure we're going to discuss this in the ensuing debate. Thomas, if I could ask you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's a great thing to be here. We had a meeting of all our ambassadors in the Eastern Partnership and beyond these last days. Ambassador Świtalski was one of the participants, and it was a very good discussion, and it's a good place to have this discussion because, as I already said a number of times yesterday, Professor Tobias Schumacher is the only chair for the neighborhood policy in the entire world. There is no other chair for neighborhood policy. Well, possibly even the entire galaxy, but that we don't know for sure. So it is already good to speak with him and with you on a subject that you're so focused on. And some of you will travel to Armenia. Others, by the way, will travel to Brussels quite soon. So looking forward to seeing you there as well. Now, obviously, the Eastern Partnership is a complex construction and a challenging one because it was constructed in a situation where we did not have agreement amongst the member states of the European Union about the finality of the process for each and every member of this partnership. I think that the formula we had about the 20 deliverables for 2020 was an excellent one. The idea to focus on areas such as strengthening institutions and good governance, development, economic development, connectivity, people-to-people contacts was the right focus. And by the way, I saw that in your paper, I leafed through it already, you're focusing exactly on these areas as well and seeing how we can take this forward. We've achieved some good results, but there are areas where the Eastern Partnership and where the countries of the Eastern Partnership clearly have to continue to work. One obvious one is good governance and fighting corruption, which remains a challenge in all partnership countries and which a fight that needs to be continued. In the field of people-to-people contacts, there are things that one can achieve more easily, like, for instance, free roaming, which is something that we need to work on and which would be very beneficial, amongst other things, for the students of the College of Europe coming from Eastern Europe and from the region. The Eastern Partnership, as you know, is based on two key principles: inclusivity and differentiation. And if you discuss the future of the Eastern Partnership, in my opinion, it is easier to achieve consensus on what inclusivity means than to achieve consensus on what differentiation means. I think that everybody thinks it is a good idea to have the 6 partner countries together in an inclusive framework, even if their ambitions are different. And I've always believed that in the broader political sense, it's in the advantage of the front runners in this process, the 3 associated partners, to be able to point to the 3 others, and perhaps even more so to the 3 others for other reasons, to be able to say that they're in the group with others who have a more ambitious way forward. And again, I mean, I listened carefully to Jan Hofmokl's suggestions. Some of them contained ideas on how to highlight the fact that this is a group of 6. But as I said, the more difficult question is what you do about differentiation. Clearly, we always say, by the way, when we speak to Eastern partners, when we speak to others, we say this is a concept that is not directed against third countries, and this is not a concept that forces you to make binary choices between us and more specifically Russia. And I have to say I had an interesting conversation a few weeks ago with one of the ambassadors of the associate partner countries in Brussels, who said to me, but we would like to make a binary choice. And honestly, for the moment at least, such a binary choice is not on offer. I think there's no consensus amongst member states about the, as I said, the finality of having countries, further countries from the Eastern Partnership join the European Union. On the other hand, there's also no consensus to say no. But it is also clear to me that this equation will not change fundamentally in the next few years, and therefore we'll have to continue to work precisely on what we can do in the field of differentiation. And I think that some of the ideas that Jan mentioned, especially legal approximation, working together in certain areas of the internal market, covering new areas that are not yet covered by the agreements, is something that we should focus on. New institutions may perhaps be a little more difficult. But obviously, because you, Jan, mentioned the United Kingdom, the challenge is that at least for the moment, the Eastern partners seem to be aspiring to a closer relationship with the internal market than the United Kingdom. And that is something that we will certainly have to look at. So obviously, a difficult discussion, a discussion that I will be interested to pursue with you here. But there's also the broader political context, and that is my last point. In my capacity, and I mentioned this today also, as what is called the Managing Director for Europe in the External Action Service, I participate in daily meetings of the other managing directors, the rest of the senior management, and the Managing Director for Europe is the person responsible for relations with countries in Europe that are not members of the European Union. And then I have my colleagues who tell me what's happening in various parts of Africa. I have colleagues who speak about Venezuela and Latin America. I have colleagues who speak about great crisis in Syria and in Libya. And then when I finally take the floor, because it's quite a lengthy meeting, as these meetings sometimes are, I'm often tempted to say, I've never yet done it, but I will certainly say it in one of these next weeks. And now let me speak of the region where the European Union matters. And I have to say, this is precisely the point. Europe is the place where we matter, where we can make a difference, and where some even see us as rivals. And I think that is the important angle that we have to look at. We have to continue to make a change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your impulse and for these very forceful words, which I fully subscribe to. Thank you also for putting on the table two issues that we have only touched upon throughout today, one of which is finality, and the question as to whether this entire framework actually is a means to an end or an end itself. And if it were to be a means to an end, the question would be, what end, in fact? And secondly, you addressed the issue of differentiation. Allow me to just add a footnote. To the extent that I read developments in the Eastern Partnership, we already are at a stage in a situation where the policy, I prefer to call it a framework, in fact is already differentiated, given that de facto it's a 3+2+1 project. Ambassador Świtalski, the floor is yours. You're next.
Thank you. I believe that the future of Eastern Partnership is solid as long as there are people who are really so interested in Eastern Partnership delivering concrete results like you are. Although I must say, and this paper that you prepared contains a number of very useful suggestions, very valuable suggestions. Although I must realize that Armenians probably must have gone to bed before finishing this declaration, because what I find in the declaration is that you suggest that all the other countries follow the example of Azerbaijan and Georgia and conduct the European Week. In Armenia, we have a European month starting on the 8th of May and finishing the first weekend of June. You want us to go back? This is your expectation? Wait until I'm gone. This year we do it the full distance. Look, there are three serious challenges for the future of Eastern Partnership. First, absolute dominance of the bilateral agenda over the multilateral component. For every participant in Eastern Partnership, the bilateral agenda is by far the most important thing in the world. The rest, the multilateral seen as a distant component. Even more, for some of them, association countries, the multilateral component is seen as something dragging down the bilateral agenda. For the other countries, it is seen in a different way as a rebalancing act, knowing that one of the big neighbors in the East doesn't quite like the Eastern Partnership. And as we know, every psychologist knows that if you want to engage into a transgression, do it collectively. Second, it is, no, it's serious, it's serious. The second challenge is, of course, diverging expectations and interests of the partner countries towards the European Union, and the finality question. How to manage this aspect, working collectively, should be really responded to, because I believe this is one of the most serious challenges, and Thomas spoke about it at length. So the third challenge that we do not speak about is the diverging level of attention and interest on the part of individual members of the European Union. And I think merely even investigating the level of representation of Eastern Partnership summits shows you that what we see as a bloc, as a solid bloc of 28 or 27 states, in fact, is not so solid when coming to the Eastern Partnership. So how to address these three challenges? We are now at a pragmatic stage. I mean, 20 deliverables for 2020 is called a pragmatic phase in the history of Eastern Partnership, which I believe sells well, at least some of the goals. 10T, selling very well, including in Armenia, although they have a problem why Georgia is getting 3 times more than them. But at least the public opinion knows. So among these 20 deliverables, there are some which show the usefulness of Eastern Partnership and the attractiveness of to the public opinion. How we will be able to assess the implementation of these 20 deliverables, and it's coming quite soon, this is a different story, because I believe that on some of them we will have a difficulty to explain why it was not possible. And I'm not referring to the visa liberalization dialogue for Armenia. No, no. But we will have a difficulty. So my reply to the future is safe. Jokingly, I can say there is a law in international relations, which I call Professor Rothfeld's law. Every international institution outlives the purposes for which it was established, but none is eternal. So in particular, if you add secretariat, if you add this institution I mentioned, you can be really safe about the future. But on a serious note, I believe that the best approach is variable geometry, doing things in small circles by allowing these states who are interested in going closer to the European Union to use Eastern Partnership as an instrument for getting closer. Because not that all are interested. And if you do it, I believe you can combine the two, sense of purpose on our side and sense of usefulness on their side. The second aspect, engaging other partners, in particular neighbors. I am a supporter of the idea, when I look at South Caucasus and you see Iran and Turkey, ending Eastern Partnership simply on the borders and one of it is closed is problematic. Because even now, in Armenia, we are talking about, final sentence, we are talking about projects dealing with connectivity with the other partners, like Iran, for instance. We have this Turkey connection. So I believe that, for instance, for Armenia, not only for Armenia, for Azerbaijan, also for Georgia, if you find a formula for engaging other agents, partners, then again you will increase the attractiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and also for complying with our time regime. Again, I very much appreciate that you, like in fact the previous speakers, also alluded to the in fact attractiveness and achievements made, attractiveness of the 20 deliverables and achievements made in that very framework. As again, this demonstrates to some extent that all too often we tend to focus on a much broader picture, and all too often, as I think was said yesterday in a different context by Richard Giragosian, we in fact ignore the many achievements and successes on the sort of micro level that truly matter and make a difference to people. At the same time, I would also want to add that you certainly helped us sleep much better tonight by saying that the future is safe. And I'm sure our friends coming from Eastern Partnership countries which are exposed to territorial occupation and violation of their sovereignty would appreciate that very much. I now give the floor to you, Elena, and like the other speakers, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I'm going to give you an academic perspective, all in 5 minutes. So, Tobias began this conference with a very somber outlook on the decline in EU legitimacy in the neighbourhood. So, thinking about it, it may well be a good thing. Why? Because we tend to learn better from our failure than actually becoming complacent with our success. And this also allows us to stay very reflective of what we do and whether we can do it better. So I guess this being reflective actually has brought us to this new framework, which we're operating now, today, well, since 2016, which is all about resilience thinking. And I was a bit surprised that no one actually mentioned it until I came to speak. So resilience, what is it? Just literally in few words, it's a very, very ambiguous concept. It may seem to be an ambiguous concept, but I think contrary to conventional meaning that a lot of scholars and also policymakers refer to it today, it is, I'd say, less about, or not just about bouncing back, or even bouncing forward. It is also, and most importantly, about communities taking control, communities becoming the center of that thinking, especially in terms of building and developing their own destiny. So why is it important? Why this turn in our reflexivity is so important now? Because it forces us to rethink the meaning of what local is. So my first point, very briefly, resilience thinking is a very important turn about reconceptualizing the local. First of all, because it offers further differentiation that a few speakers referred to. Because remember, when we started Eastern Partnership back in 2008, it was all a very broad brush approach. There was a basket of countries, and what did we know about those countries? Now we are coming actually to a very important crunch point, a juncture, that we now can focus on countries individually, tailored, contextualized approach. The second important advantage here is that it is very much an inside-out approach. It is not for the EU to come with all these external ideas and external solutions, no matter how much experience it might have. It actually allows us focus and gives responsibility to the communities for building their own destiny. So it is not about embedding EU vision international programs. It is about the vision of those communities and the help they might request based on that. And the third important point of this resilience thinking that I've already mentioned is that it is community. It is about community. And as resilience was defined in one of the, I think it's Commission's document of 2011, it is about inner strength of that community, and it is also about capacity, which is not equatable to the capacity of the state or even the civil society, because community is much closer to what we think. It is about our locality, it is about our neighborhood. And it is also not about, surprisingly so, not about material or institutional resources. It is first and foremost about identity of that community, what makes us strong, what makes us striving for better life, for good life, what brings us all together. That's what Mahala or Kishlak or even Tovarishchestvo, you know, in Eastern Neighbourhood, that what all of this refers to that. So all well and good about resilience be put on the table, but how do we work with it? How do we operationalize it? How do we shift the focus from where we are now to the local self-governance? And that's where, of course, the challenges are. I'd say a couple of things. It is a long road requiring commitment, and also requiring commitment to stay reflective and agile. It is also not about securitization, because now a lot of documents refer to resilience first and foremost in security terms, because being safe does not amount or does not equate to being resilient, because resilience precisely about dealing with uncertainty. And uncertainty does not give us security. Uncertainty makes us more agile so that we can cope with it better, but does not mean that we would feel secure here and now. It is also about, it is not about outside in, I've already mentioned that. And one important point, it is also about capacity, not building capacity, because we are not starting from scratch with those countries. It's about capacity development. And that's where I'd say that 20 deliverables, unfortunately, do not really fit the bill here, I'm afraid. Because resilience thinking does not work with planning. It does not set deliverables. It responds to challenges. It responds to uncertainty. It therefore responds to the challenges that arise in those countries, inside out. Probably, I'm finishing now. Looking at problem at source, and also looking at ENI. Guess how much budget this complementary approach to capacity development is given, precisely to deal with those challenges that might arise. 5% of the entire budget. So I think we need to be a bit more creative if we are to work with resilience thinking and resilience approach. So, answering the bigger question in search of a new momentum here. Has the Eastern Partnership run its course? You know, there is a saying in English, so the king is dead, long live the king. So I'd say perhaps the Eastern Partnership, the way it was conceived then, perhaps it may well has run its course, but it means that we need to turn the corner and we need to become a bit more creative by shifting the focus onto the local, because resilience is about self-governance. And resilience is about good life, and I'm finishing now, but it is also about thinking about the region on its own, in a sense that what it is, what it wants to achieve, and also a bit more connectivity in that thinking. So it's not just Eastern Partnership, it is not just Central Asia, it is wider Eurasia, which means also factoring countries like Russia and other neighbors into the picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. It resonates, apparently. Just a tiny little comment. You mentioned the European Union's reflexivity or self-reflectiveness. On that very note, I think all too often many of us tend to indulge in fact in this sort of impulsive EU bashing, and I myself am also part of that group occasionally. I can't help it. Nobody's perfect. But in fact, honor to who honor is due. One also has to state occasionally and give the European Union some credit for it, that there hardly is any other actor in the international system that is, in fact, as self-reflective as the European Union is. Yeah? And exactly. And the second point is I'm also grateful to you, Elena, for embedding this conversation in, say, some of the principles and paradigms of the global strategy of 2016, one of which, again, is resilience building. The other is the idea of principled pragmatism. And I very much subscribe to what you have been saying with respect to the idea that we have to be more creative in how, in fact, we engage in resilience building, because there is, of course, a risk that the way resilience building has been defined in the global strategy is being misinterpreted by non-democratic regimes in the Eastern Neighbourhood as a kind of carte blanche that we hand over to them and let them do whatever they please and get away with all their human rights violations. Radu, you're the last one in the row, and then we open the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Schumacher. Excellencies, dear guests, dear professors, dear students, good evening, everyone. First of all, allow me to thank you for this opportunity to be part of such a distinguished panel with very experienced speakers. And I'll try to address this issue or the topic of our panel from three perspectives. From the perspective of a participant of the New Generation Summit that we held yesterday, from the perspective as a youth representative from the Eastern Partnership country, and also from a perspective of a believer in the idea that societies together are stronger and are more resilient. And you mentioned before about the resilience, I was about to mention this. So first of all, when we look at the future of the Eastern Partnership from our perspective of young generation, we also put quite similar questions as you did, or as the speakers did before. When we ask ourselves, what does the EU, but also not only the EU, the Eastern Partnership countries want from this policy at the end of the day? And where it goes beyond some specific or set frameworks, such as 2020 deliverables. What's next after 2020 deliverables? And this was emphasized also at 2017 Eastern Partnership Summit, when this new vision came up and discussed in Brussels. And many even academics affirmed the fact, as Ms. Korosteleva, that this Eastern Partnership moved had a shift from the emphasis on the common values to the common interests. And I'll bring this point of the common values a bit later. Still, the future holds many challenges, as I mentioned. And this region holds challenges such as, first of all, corruption, rule of law, the lack of capacity, and the most important is the lack of political willingness to reform the institutions and to fulfill the requirements that are set up in the institutional framework, such as association agreements and the CFTA. These challenges will reduce the capacity to explore at the maximum this policy that was designed in not a very structured or not in a very focused manner at 2009, but it will bring the results that could be achieved. Second of all, in terms of economic cooperation, and it has been emphasized here today, I think this is one of the most or the greatest opportunity that these 6 Eastern Partnership countries can benefit from this cooperation with the European Union, and can reduce the existing social gaps and imbalances in their societies. And here we came up during our summit with various problems and challenges, such as the migration or immigration. And here the case of Moldova is one of the most telling, where Moldova is the 11th in the world in terms of immigration. Each day, like, several people are leaving the country. And here we emphasize one more time that it's very important that EU and Eastern Partnership countries should work more on creating those opportunities that can attract people back. And this leads me to the next point of the young people. I believe, and we believe, that Eastern Partnership has a future, and it's alive. And in this future, but most important, this present, youth should play a decisive role. Many times has been emphasized by the European Commission, but also by EEAS, that youth is at the heart of the EU and Eastern Partnership cooperation. And it should be so. And this declaration is just another example of the fact that youth opinion should be taken into account when the policy making process is taking place. When the next targets are set up, youth also should participate into this. Another challenge that has been discussed, and I think it's very important, it emphasized the idea of the communication in the Eastern Partnership, but also the visibility of Eastern Partnership in the European Union. We many times talk only one-way direction, the EU to EP, but many times we forget, like, that other side, the EP and the EU, and how much the EP project or the EP policy is known in the EU member states or the European Union in general. And in these terms, we think more things should be done. And in conclusion, everyone takes something from every event, being it's an impression, an opinion. Me, myself, and I think all participants from the New Generation Summit, we had a fruitful debate, and we are taking from this conference, I guess, one of the most important things, that Eastern Partnership should, and it has to be continued, and youth should be there when policymakers are doing or drafting their plans, the next plans. We should be part of this process, and we should contribute. Only this we can bring out the change that we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radu, for providing us also with your input. I suggest, as we have some 20 minutes left, let's open the floor, let's collect questions and comments. There already are quite a number of them. I'll go to the very back on the right side. Ostap, yes.
Good evening. My name is Ostap Kushnir. I'm working at Warsaw University. So my question is to Professor Korosteleva. I listened to your speech very carefully because I'm working with a methodology of critical geopolitics, and what you are referring to is I mean, it resonates with what I'm working right now. In particular, I mean, Colin Flint, professor from the United States, he works with the concepts of places, communities, and spaces. And he says that actually every community has an identification of its own space, and that identification is being built through comparison to other spaces. Yes, so that's what you also mentioned by referring to those local activities, local communities. And he also says that actually every community has its vision of justice and order, what is right and what is wrong, and based on that it builds up itself, actually. But Mr. Flint also speaks of the concept of scale. Therefore, I mean, I have questions. First, how would you embrace scaling to the resilience? So community of the people who live on one street and community of the people who live in one state EP state. Secondly, there is also a theory of informational domination by Jacques Ellul. So who dominates the media shapes the community. How would you embrace that? And third, private actors, they are usually more efficient in dealing with resilience issues than state actors. How would you embrace private actors, especially media actors, into your picture? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I almost felt I was in a PhD seminar, but I appreciate your question. Anna, you are next.
Hello, I am Anna from Armenia, and actually I don't have a question. I just want to express my gratitude because I'm coming from Eastern Partnership country, and you are speaking about you are very critical about Eastern Partnership, but I want to mention that actually this program changed the life of a lot of people from these countries, including me, because I am holding the scholarship from EMP, and I just want to say that we believe what you are doing and we want to contribute what you are doing. Thank you.
And yes, please, Lorin.
Good evening. My name is Lorin Stan. I'm a student of the College of Europe, and I would like to address you one question. How can the phenomenon of state capture, which we have to consider in our eastern neighborhood and also in some Eastern European countries, be addressed in future? Thank you.
And let us collect one more. Yes, Wissam, you went next in the row.
Thank you. Oh, that's very loud. This question is addressed to Professor Korosteleva. When you started mentioning about resilience, I began being very attentive. This is a comment and a question of combination. The comment is that within the 2015 revision of the ENP, we started witnessing what Professor Schumacher mentioned, the principle pragmatism. We started seeing a lot of resilience-based approach, both in the eastern but also in the southern neighborhood. When we talk about resilience, I would say it's about scoping. It's like when you enforce or implement an approach within a given society, and you allow the public society to cope with their situation. So given the fact that a resilient-based approach from the European Union, it got implemented within a non-democratic regime, you're basically allowing the public society to cope with the fact that they are living in a non-democratic regime, living in a country that does not, let's say, have a respect for human rights, etc. Is this a contradictory to the European values to somehow send a message in resilience-based approach saying that you have to cope with the fact that you're living in a society or in a country that does not respect EU values? Are we moving away from democratization and more of resilient-based approach based on the aforementioned? Thank you.
Allow me to pose that very question also to the three of you, the issue of principled pragmatism. And I would like to rephrase it as well a little bit. Isn't it a bit of a contradiction in terms? Principled pragmatism, isn't it an either-or that eventually should or has to be applied? Can these two be combined? And to what extent is that representing a departure of past approaches on the part of the European Union? Who would like to start? Elena. You.
Right. Could I perhaps begin with a short disclaimer, because picking up on your comment, maybe I've given the wrong impression in the sense that what I was trying to say is that we are here to celebrate the fact that actually the EU, in its approach to the outside world, to the neighborhood in particular, is very reflective, and that makes the EU very agile in thinking. So why the policy has not The policy has not been a success, but the policy has not been a failure. So there are kind of leaps and kind of bounds moving in a zigzag way, but the EU is learning from it. And I think this is the best way for us to stay reflective, not to be complacent, to adjust what we have in terms of instruments and actually even excel in terms of our offers. That's why we've come to this juncture now thinking in terms of resilience, because resilience in this world full of challenges, uncertainties, emergencies, we know that we may not have the knowledge to cope with all of that. We know that the communities are struggling with a lot of challenges, with a lot of uncertainty, with a lot of unpredictability. That's where resilience becomes so important, in a sense that, yes, let's make communities, let's give them a bit more responsibility in terms of how they see their future. Make them responsible means that they're the investors, they're the stakeholders, and the use here actually is actually to act as a mentor, as a partner, as as an assistant in terms of helping with needs. But you're right, resilience has been misinterpreted in many different ways. And that is one of the kind of points that the scholarly community is currently working on, to bring perhaps a bit more kind of explicit definition of resilience. Resilience is not about coping, not just about coping, because if we all cope, we would not make our state or existence better. We just respond and adapt. And sometimes adaptability is not a particularly good thing, because we just adapt to the conditions that may not necessarily be good for us in terms of our self-development. Resilience is much more than that. It's not just about bouncing back, responding to challenges. Let's say we've been destroyed, we've restored. No, it's about bouncing forward. It's about transforming ourselves. It's about reforming ourselves. But you cannot undertake reforms without having a sense of identity, not just identity for what we are as community, but the identity for significant we, where we want to be, as small community, as a community sort of on the scale of a state. And that's what I think makes resilience particularly attractive. It is not what is designed for us, or as you said, imposed on us. No, it is how we see where we want to be. And that's what we could perhaps then request assistance in terms of helping us with all sorts of instruments, how to get there. I'm not going to engage, I hope I've answered some, but not all. Okay, thank you.
Who would like to come in on the principled pragmatism? Thomas, you go first.
Well, perhaps not only on the principled pragmatism. I would start, perhaps if I may, on resilience. I mean, I don't want to define it. It's basically about making societies able to sustain external shocks and living in internally and externally difficult circumstances. And obviously what we're doing goes in that direction, primarily, of course, also by promoting good governance and the rule of law, because this is one of the main factors of making a society resilient, not the only one. Obviously, helping countries to be resilient in the Eastern Partnership does not mean that we're providing them with a security guarantee. I think that also has to be said. We're doing our best to strengthen these societies, but at the same time it requires a willingness of these societies to go down that road, and more specifically also of the leadership of these countries to work on these lines. We cannot impose reforms, good governance against the will of the local leadership. I think that principled pragmatism or pragmatic, it's not about pragmatic principles. It's basically that in this plurality of situations that we have in the European, in the Eastern Partnership, we obviously apply the strictest criteria to the countries that have the greatest ambitions. It is clear that in the case of Belarus, our cooperation is not aimed at regime change in Belarus, to put it in these terms. We can cooperate in certain areas with Belarus. We have developed dialogue with civil society in Belarus, which goes beyond what was possible in the past. But obviously there are limits to what can reasonably be done, and we still have an interest in cooperating with Belarus because of the regional role that Belarus plays. A more complex issue is the case of the Republic of Moldova, and you spoke about state capture. the leverage of the European Union is limited in societies where the leadership doesn't require, at the end of the day, the support of the European Union to continue in its own interests, in its own situation. It's a little bit like the problem we had with what used to be the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia over a long period, where whatever we had as pulling force didn't apply to the government because it didn't pull the government. And we have this discussion, this complex discussion about more for more. And it's true that countries that want to move further on their path towards the European Union, we have to think about additional incentives. And this is what Jan was thinking about. This is what I was thinking about. At the same time, we also probably have to think about less for less. In a situation like the one that we are confronted with precisely in the Republic of Moldova right now, this is a very serious discussion. This is a process that will have to continue in a formula of differentiation, taking into account the respective ambitions of countries. Let me say, because I don't want to interrupt this extremely interesting discussion, that I will have to leave a little early, and I hope that the other members of the panel will continue the discussion. I have a very good reason why I have to leave early. I have to go back punctually to Brussels so as to be able to come back for my course here next Monday. So if I don't go back now, it's more difficult for me to come back on Monday. So I hope for your understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
2 points. First, security. Mr. Moderator, you distorted a little bit what I said when I was talking about safe future, because I was referring not to individual countries and the feeling of security, but to the future of the Eastern Partnership. But it prompted me to talk about security, because one of the weak points of Eastern Partnership, as seen from the vantage point of some countries like Armenia, is its weak security dimension. Armenia is a typical example, a country very focused on the issue of security, and we have a framework which is not offering anything on it. Its usefulness becomes relative. Of course, I believe in a good future of the security dimension, security cooperation in the European Union. So I believe that there will be a kind of transmission of the enhanced security cooperation in the European Union within the framework of the Eastern Partnership. But I believe this is a very important aspect which has to be discussed when we will be brainstorming about the next phase of Eastern Partnership. The second issue, values. This is a tough issue. This is a tough issue also as seen from the perspective of Armenia, even before the revolution. Because we were accused, even some Armenians were accused, that we in Eastern Partnership would favor a geopolitical approach. We grouped the countries without paying any attention to the issue of values, their performance in terms of human rights and democracy. We treat them equally. We do not want to differentiate. And, you know, they were looking, I mean, you adopt, one-size-fits-all approach in terms of values, which is not true, but that was the perception. On the ground, the European Union is the last of the Mohicans when talking about values. Let's face it, at least the last couple of years, without the European Union, some of the reforms, and we can be frustrated with Moldova, with other countries, but without the European Union, it wouldn't move at all without the external pressure of the European Union. So if we are sometimes accused that we forget about values, in fact, we are the last of the Mohicans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 5 to 10 more minutes to collect some more questions or comments. Yes. On the right here. Fine.
It's a comment and a question. I'm not such an expert like Tobias and you on the neighborhood policies. But many of the discussions this morning and also at the last panel reminded me at the discussion we had in the 1990s also with NATO's extension to the east, when many of the finality questions had been addressed. And at that time I was working in the office of the NATO Secretary General, so I have some kind of insights. And we should remind ourselves how these discussions started. And that was 1 year after the end of the Warsaw Pact, when Poland and other members were already addressing the question of the membership. And nobody of Germany and the other NATO member states were ready to accept that kind of issue. But we had to do something. And we came up with a catalogue of conditions. Yeah? And we were all thinking, well, these countries will need another 20 years before they are able to fulfill the conditions. And after 4 or 5 years, we discovered, hoppla, these countries have fulfilled these kind of conditions. And that put us under the question, and the question of credibility with our policies. And we realized at the very end we had no other choice than to go ahead with NATO's extension to the east. Against that kind of background, the lesson which had been drawn on the EU side was, oh, sorry, we had a real problem on the other hand, because we did not take sufficiently into account the Russian interest. And that played a larger role in our integration policies with the Balkan states as well as with the neighborhood policies. To which extent we can go ahead with integration policies, with support policies, the democratization value policies, as well as, on the other hand, to take so-called Russian interests into account. Now we had a real crisis with the Balkan strategy until last year, because we realized there's a political vacuum which we created with our policies of doing almost nothing, with a policy of neglect of attention. It opens the doors for the Russian as well as for the Chinese influence at the expense of our influence. And the reason, the reason for that, which concerned us and which changed then also the EU policies over the last years, was that we felt there's a huge disappointment and concerns that we lose the hopes of the younger generation in these countries, which then changed the EU policies since the last year. And now these things play a certain role, and I think I was wondering to which extent we take these lessons, so-called, into account by taking, of course, all the differences into account between the neighborhood policies and the Balkan policies and the NATO policies in the 1990s. But many of the issues, beyond doing the homework of the side of the regional states, need to be addressed on the EU side by itself.
Thank you, Frank. There are 2 questions. Well, sorry, there was one here on the right and then the 2 in the back.
I'm Smail Ayyabash, I'm from Algeria. 3 Eastern Partnership countries have signed association agreement with the EU, but Armenia became member of Euro-Asian Union, and Belarus is not so much willing to cooperate with the EU. Azerbaijan is negotiating with the EU for a comprehensive association agreement. Do you think Eastern Partnership brought this 6 countries closer to the EU as it's aimed? And do you think Eastern Partnership is a success story?
Who do you address your question to?
For the whole of the panel. Yeah.
For the entire panel, right. And 2 questions.
Good evening. My name is Ksenia. I'm also a College of Europe alumni, which also, of course, became possible to the Eastern Partnership, which I'm also deeply grateful to. My question is based on the point that Ambassador Świtalski made, that actually one of the challenges Eastern Partnership is facing now is also different level of interest of member states in this initiative. Because Eastern Partnership, as any long-term relations, has its ups and downs, and there also was, or maybe still, even now, there's a period which can be called like Eastern Partnership fatigue. And my question is, what can be a point, how can we boost this interest among all member states in this initiative? Whether it can be like external problems, issues like Brexit, can we expect that such moments, such issues can boost this interest and to make European Union to look at other countries which would like to cooperate, whether we need to wait for other internationally important event like it was revolution in Ukraine. So how can we address this challenge and what can be these factors to this interest? Thank you.
And there's another one, a last one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good evening. My name is Katerina Prishchep. I work here in Natolin, and I have a very speculative question, but to promote imagination, maybe creative thinking. This question to Director Hofmokl and Ambassador Świtalski. The previous experience has shown that the countries of the Eastern Partnership can concentrate effort and work at least for a short period creatively, intensely, if there is an aim ahead. So in case of Ukraine and Moldova, visa-free travel and so on. So in order to achieve some further cooperation between those countries of Eastern Partnership, which I guess is a big problem that the EU would like to encourage it more, but it's lacking, and also to improve the implementation of association agreement. Is it possible to imagine such thing as some free trade area which would, or maybe sort of model some area modeled on European economic area, which would include EU and those maybe all Eastern Partnership countries or the most progressed Eastern Partnership countries, which, basically this would be a big goal which would probably be a motivation for the states to improve and implement on their signed already agreement. So I imagine there would be some arguments against that idea, and I would be gladly hearing from, for instance, Director Hofmokl, why not? But maybe there will be arguments for that proposal, and I would like to hear if there are any. Thank you.
I hand over to you right away, Jan. How to boost member states' interest in the project and the question
success
regarding
story.
Yes.
For God's sake, where would we be without the Eastern Partnership? And then it's easy to criticize, but you really don't know in what state and shape we would have been if not for the interest of all of the 28 member states into the region. Second element, the last thing I want is to have the interest of the High Representative in the Eastern Partnership. Why? Because if she finds time in her schedule to deal with the Eastern Partnership, it means that there is a war and a crisis. The Eastern Partnership is a success precisely because we don't have to tackle it from the perspective of a major crisis in the region. Third element, I completely disagree that that ambitions are set, which means that there are 3 more ambitious countries and 3 less ambitious countries. That's completely untrue. The ambition should be measured by the deeds, by the achievements. And believe me, what Armenia did by turning its back to an association agreement and DCFTA and coming back to an agreement that is 95% based on an association agreement is far more ambitious than actually declaring your ambitions and not doing the reforms at the end of the day. So we should measure the whole framework by what these countries want from us and how they approach their declarations. And to say that, I just want to emphasize that there's a huge difference between the Eurasian Economic Union and whatever the EU proposes, and this difference is called voluntary agreements. We're not forcing anyone to team up with us. Armenia wanted to be part of the Eurasian Economic Union, fine. You don't want to benefit from a single market of 500 million people who describe their happiness by the fact of spending money, by consuming. I mean, you don't want that, fine, with us. We still want to have bilateral relations with you, and this is why, this is the beauty of the whole approach. Just maybe one word on principled pragmatism, and then to make it short, I completely agree with Thomas, and that no one is giving up, but the fact that it's on voluntary basis, means that we're not pushing reforms. I mean, who these countries are doing reforms for at the end of the day? They are not doing them to please Portugal or Poland. These reforms are for the benefit of people living there. We are there to help. It's a hand that is stretched. You can grab it. No one forces you to do that. We have an interest in these countries grabbing this hand of support. So we put cookies here and there. But again, the EU will not force them to reform if they don't want to. And another layer of pragmatism is that we might disagree on many things with, for instance, President Lukashenko, but we have one goal in common. I mean, we all want an independent Belarus at the end of the day. Maybe we differ on how we would see Belarus in the future, but if you want to be a ruler, you need a country to rule. If you want to have a partner, you need a country to partner with. So for me, there's a huge challenge in placing the Holy Grail, the political Holy Grail, somewhere. And maybe we are, and you're right by saying we are at the moment of NATO in the 90s. We don't really dare to place the Holy Grail. But again, we're not speaking of a perspective of 10 to 15 years. There's just one element that everyone in the college should recall, and that is no European state asking to launch enlargement negotiations were declined to launch them. There is a set of criteria you need to fulfill under Article 2, under Article 49. I mean, no one says you're going to finish these negotiations. But the moment you get ready, the EU is ready to start discussing. And again, the neighborhood policy and the EAP being an umbrella allowing some to hide behind those called more ambitious is extremely important. And you may call it a kindergarten for anything that might happen in the future. So you just need this umbrella to allow some partner countries to get ready to take the decision whether or not they would like to join a union. We don't know how this union will look like. We all hope it's going to be strong, but maybe they will not want to join it at some point. It's up to us to make it attractive. To make it attractive, we need to reform ourselves. Thanks very much.
Can I say two observations? First, the level of interests of EU member states in the Eastern Partnership. It's a fact that it's different, it's diverging. Come to Armenia. There are 11 EU embassies there, 11. Egypt has an embassy. Spain doesn't have an embassy. Iraq has an embassy. Iraq. The Netherlands, no. And so on and so forth. The role of Eastern Partnership, I agree here with the director, has been also initially to try to boost more interest in that part of Europe, which I believe is so crucial for the European Union. But the fact is that this level of interest is different. How to increase it, how to persuade these countries that what is happening there in South Caucasus, or I don't know, in Belarus is more important than what is happening in Nepal or in Colombia is a different story. And I think that there should be a discussion. At least I'm discussing it with every visitor from these countries who are not represented in Armenia. The second issue, the level of ambitions. Again, we can have different opinions, but as they say, we do not have the right to have our own facts. And the facts are that there are different ambitions. The picture is not so simple. For instance, Eastern Partnership. My experience 2.5 years ago, 2 informal ministerial meetings in Yerevan. Foreign ministers, only one came, only one. Out of 5 invited, only one came. What the others were telling is a different story. I cannot share it with you because it's quite confidential. But if somebody has an illusion that ambitions are the same, I mean, reality check. Different ambitions, and they are visible at every Eastern Partnership ministerial or meeting. But big success, sectoral meeting, ministers of science and research came, all of them, and enjoyed the time unbelievably. So, you know, we have to take into account that some of them want more, some less, but the picture is, of course, not so simple. We have to take into account, I believe, increasingly, if you want the Eastern Partnership platform to bring real, tangible benefits for these countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have to draw this session to a close, but I wouldn't want to do that without giving the two panelists to my left the very final say and word. 1 minute each, please.
Okay, thank you. There was a good question about the future of Eastern Partnership. Of course, Eastern Partnership is going to stay, and it's good that it stays because it gives so many opportunities to the people in the region. But it will stay as long as it remains attuned to the needs of the people in the region. And that's where comes the question about principle pragmatism. I mean, there is no contradiction there if we understand it correctly. Principles, of course, they're all about the different models of good governance that the EU is here to offer. That's where the principles are, about how we can work better together. But pragmatism, of course, comes with understanding the needs. And of course, each one of our partner countries is different, and that's where pragmatism really comes in. But it is also, there was a question about contradiction, how resilience can work in non-democratic regimes. If I were to borrow Richard's phrase from the morning, he said it's all about education, engagement and empowerment. I really like that 3E. Do you think if we do that as part of our resilient thinking approach, any community being educated, empowered and engaged would actually choose an authoritarian government? I leave it open.
Thank you.
Maybe I can answer yes. And as an example, I mean, presenting the young people that are really committed, and I'm talking about here also about the initiative that I represent, the Young European Ambassadors, those that are kind of some young leaders in the region that try to be involved and manage to some extent to send a message. But I wanted to talk briefly about the question of the EP fatigue. And in one meeting in Brussels with some EU officials, I also asked this question about the EP fatigue and if there is such a thing in the EU member states or at the EU level. And I got the answer that there is no such a thing as fatigue, because we are here, we are working, we want this policy or this partnership to exist. But the fatigue, I guess, is a result of the fact that maybe some, or not maybe, but more concretely, that some of the reforms or of the commitments that are agreed by both parties are not delivered at the end. And people in the regions that we're talking about, communities and people living in those countries, they do not feel in their daily life those results of those reforms that are really so much talked about, but they do not feel like in their level of life, their standards. We talked also in the morning about the economic aspect of the situation, this FTA. People do not feel it. So as long as they do not feel, this sentiment can arise. But let's finish this on an optimistic note, and we hope this could further improve. So that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radu. As we have reached the very end of this panel, and in fact the very end of this conference, which, as far as I can see at least, was very educating, engaging, and maybe to some even empowering. I would like to thank the panelists of this particular panel, as well as all previous panelists and moderators and chairs. Of course, I would like to thank you, the audience, the participants, and everyone that participated and contributed to making this conference happen and, in fact, make it a success. A particular thanks goes again to the ENP Student Society, which, as I said this very morning, has been very much pushing for this conference to take place, and as well yesterday's Youth Summit. Last but not least, I would like to ask all of you to join me in giving a very warm round of applause to my dear colleague Maja Olszewska, as well as my other colleagues here at the college. In making this conference possible in the first place. And of course, I would also like to extend my sincere thanks to the Vice Rector, who has been giving her relentless support to this initiative as well over the past couple of months, as well as all technicians, all staff here at the college. A big thank you to them as well. I wish all of you safe travels back home. Those of you who still stay here in Warsaw, a very nice evening, and eventually, as of tomorrow afternoon, evening, a very nice weekend. And to my colleagues here on the panel, please keep up your very good and important work. It's appreciated. Thank you.